Clinton County Board of Elections, Precinct Election Official Training, Single Precinct, Election Day Processes and Procedures. This is our contact information, and it would be a good idea for you to record our cell phone numbers in your cell phone ahead of time in the event of an emergency. Also, our email addresses have changed and now end in a .gov email. Please be sure to check your spam folder to ensure that you've not missed any of our emails. There are no party-specific ballots because this is a general election. We will utilize 14 polling locations and 36 precincts. We will be fully staffed at all polling locations for this election, including some extra workers at some locations to assist with line management, curbside voting, etc. COVID-19 protocols are in place and must always be adhered to throughout the day. We are committed to the safety of our PEOs and staff, and we invested in PPE for all workers and cleaning supplies for each location, and a cleaning crew who will visit each location regularly. PEOs must wear a face mask and, in some cases, a face shield. Voters are asked to wear masks. If a voter does not have a mask, one will be provided for them. If a voter refuses to wear the mask provided, they will be asked to return to their car to curbside vote. If the voter refuses to vote curbside in their car, you cannot restrict their access to the polling location. They must be allowed to vote. You should attempt to move them through the voting process as quickly as possible with no confrontation. COVID protocols. Prior to reporting to work, precinct election officials, or PEOs, are required to take their temperature. Any temperature of 99.9 or higher will prevent one from working as a PEO. PEOs with a temperature of 99.9 and up should notify the Board of Elections as soon as possible so a PEO replacement can be dispatched. PEOs who are sick, have tested positive for COVID-19, or have recently had close contact with a person with COVID-19 should stay home. PEOs are required to wear a face covering for all in-person voting. Exceptions will be made on a case-by-case basis. Allowable exceptions include a documented condition or disability that prevents the wearing of a face covering, or the PEO needs to communicate with someone who is hearing impaired or has another disability where seeing the mouth is essential to communication. Information will be provided on the proper use, removal, and washing of cloth face coverings. Certain duties will require the use of additional personal protection equipment, including tabletop plexiglass shields, face shields, and rubber gloves. PEOs will be trained in the appropriate use of this equipment. Where social distancing is not possible, a clear plastic barrier or face shield will be used in conjunction with the face covering. PEOs should wash hands frequently. For example, before entering the polling location, before and after breaks, after touching or handling a cloth face covering or PPE, or after using the restroom or after touching shared surfaces or objects. They should wash with soap and water for a duration of at least 20 seconds. If soap and water are not readily available, an alcohol-based sanitizer that contains at least 60% alcohol is an effective remedy. PEOs should cover coughs and sneezes with a tissue or use the inside of their elbow. Used tissues should be thrown in the trash and hands washed immediately with soap and water for at least 20 seconds. If soap and water are not readily available, PEOs should use hand sanitizer that contains at least 60% alcohol. Communal eating is prohibited this year. For example, sharing of pizza, crock-pot meals, etc. Prepackaged or single-serving food or snack may be permitted. PEOs, one Democrat and one Republican, must ride together in the same vehicle to the Board of Elections office on election night after the polls close to return supplies and ballots. They should distance themselves as much as possible and continue to wear a face mask or covering. Voters must be encouraged to use face coverings while inside the polling location and/or in line to vote, although compliance is ultimately voluntary. If a voter refuses to wear a face covering after being asked, PEOs must offer the option of curbside voting. If they insist on voting in the polling location without a face covering, they must be permitted to do so. Refusal by voters to wear a face mask or covering cannot impact the voting process or the person's right to vote. All polling locations have been assessed and redesigned to be able to accommodate all COVID-19 safety protocols. Whenever possible, the flow of the voting transaction is designed to be in one linear direction with separate entrances and exits into and out of the polling location. Wherever possible, polling location doors will be propped open to increase air circulation. Opening and closing the polls. All PEOs should arrive at their assigned polling location by 5:30 a.m. If a PEO does not report by 5:30 a.m., call the Board of Elections immediately. Use your opening the polls checklist to complete all the tasks. This checklist will make sure you correctly complete all required tasks before the polls open. Your VLM can assign tasks to each team member for greater efficiency. Though you must have one PEO from each party present when opening the red ballot bag, you may begin to set up the other equipment and supplies as soon as you arrive. All PEOs must take the oath of office. A copy can be found in the polling location binder and sign under the oath on the provided lines. All PEOs must sign the ethics and payroll forms. Ensure all of your equipment was delivered, including the poll pad, ClearCast ballot scanner with ballot bag, Clear Access ADA voting machine, and Votomatics, or voting booths. Use the instructions found in the Opening the Polls checklist to set up and activate all the equipment. Post the flags outside of the polling location to mark the 100-foot area where campaigning is prohibited. The large flag should be placed at the entrance, and the two small flags should be placed 100 feet from the entrance. Ensure all the required notices are posted prior to opening the polls at 6:30 a.m. If you have any issues while opening the polls, such as missing supplies, equipment problems, a PEO no-show, call the Board of Elections at 382-3537 immediately. Polls must open at 6:30 a.m. sharp. Who is allowed in the polling place? Voters, children of voters who are not of voting age, persons checking the 11 and 4 lists, observers and only with a certificate of appointment, members of the media only with credentials, the Clinton County Sheriff's Department, other persons assigned by the Board of Elections or Secretary of State's office, for example, rovers, board members, Board of Election staff, etc., or a person assisting a voter with the voting process. Who can help a voter who needs assistance? If a voter declares they are unable to mark their ballot due to blindness, disability, or illiteracy, they can have anyone of their choosing help except the voter's employer, an agent of the voter's employer, an officer or agent of the voter's union, or a candidate appearing on the ballot. If a voter asks for assistance from PEOs, there must be both a Democratic PEO and Republican PEO to assist the voter. Any person who provides assistance in marking the ballot is forbidden from providing any information on how the voter voted. The news media is allowed in your polling location, and they are permitted to film or take pictures as long as they are not impeding or disrupting the voting process. You must ensure the media do not violate a voter's privacy. They must have valid credentials from their media outlet. If they ask questions, we recommend you do not answer them, but instead direct them to contact the Board of Elections office. They may interview any willing voters outside of the polling location as long as they do not disturb or impede voters or the process. Observers may be appointed to observe the casting and counting of ballots at one or multiple precincts on Election Day. Observers must have a certificate of appointment issued by their appointing authority to be allowed to observe a polling location. They must have a copy of that certificate of appointment to present to the VLM at the polling location to observe at that polling location. Once the observer presents their certificate of appointment, they need to be sworn in by the VLM. Observers are permitted to be present from the opening until the closing of polls. Observers may be appointed to observe the casting and counting of ballots at one or more multiple precincts on Election Day. Accordingly, an observer would be permitted to be present from 1/2 hour before the polling place opens through the time the poll workers for that precinct finish closing the polls and leave the polling location. Observers cannot handle paperwork or operate election equipment. While they can ask you questions, they cannot be disruptive. If you have any issue with an observer, do not confront them. Call the Board of Elections and we will resolve the situation. COVID protocol. Observers must be directed to practice social distancing and wear a facial covering. An observer who is unable to secure PPE may be provided such equipment by the BOE. An observer who refuses to wear a mask or covering is considered to be obstructing voting and must be positioned such that they are 6 feet from everyone else at all times. Closing the polls. The VLM should announce the close of polls at 7:30 p.m. using their cell phone as the official time. If a court order requires the polls to be open past 7:30 p.m., you will be contacted and given specific instructions. Anyone in line by 7:30 p.m. gets to vote a regular ballot. You may place a PEO at the end of the line if necessary. Voters arriving after 7:30 p.m. will have to vote a provisional ballot that will be segregated from other provisional ballots in a designated envelope with an orange label reading "Provisional ballots voted after 7:30 p.m." Use your closing the polls checklist to make sure you've completed all the required tasks correctly. After the polls close, you can take down all the vote-o-matics, but not before the polls close. Using the instructions found in your Closing the Polls checklist, shut down the ClearCast ballot scanner. The VLM will assign closing duties to the rest of the precinct team and will close out the election day on the ClearCast ballot scanner and print 2 closing reports. One report will be posted at the polling location for the public to see. One report will be signed and placed in the data pouch to return to the Board of Elections. Complete the ballot reconciliation chart. If you have problems balancing, call the BOE for help at 382-3537. When packing the red ballot bag, follow the instructions in your Closing the Polls checklist so you don't forget anything and you place it in the proper order. The Closing the Polls checklist will also list everything you should place in the blue supply bag. Most likely, if it did not go in the red ballot bag, it goes in the blue supply bag. Don't throw anything away. Ballot reconciliation may have changed since the last election you worked. The VLM will close out the election day on the ClearCast ballot scanner and print 2 closing reports. The ClearCast canvas ballot bag will be opened by the VLM and PEO number 2, and ballots removed and sorted by precinct and split. While ballot reconciliation is taking place, the rest of the precinct team will be working to tear down the polling location signs, vote-o-matics, etc. The VLM and PEO number 2 will work together to count ballots and complete the ballot reconciliation report. Voted ballots will be placed in the envelope marked Voted Ballots and placed inside the red bag for return to the Board of Elections. The empty ClearCast scanner canvas ballot bag will be sealed and the seal number recorded. The red bag contains voted ballots. It must remain under the supervision of a PEO at all times and carefully handled as it is returned to the BOE. This is what a ballot reconciliation chart looks like. You'll need to record the total number for each line over in the right-hand column. Most single precinct locations do not have active splits this election, but a couple of them do, and there will be spaces for each split. The lead PEO or VLM in this case will sign, and a precinct election official of the opposite party will sign next to that. This is an example of a correctly completed ballot reconciliation chart. You'll notice that line 1 and line 9 are the same number. The polls close at 7:30 p.m. All PEOs are expected to stay and help reconcile ballots and pack up the supply bags and poll pad. Your VLM will assign tasks to each PEO. After the ballots are reconciled, the ballots are locked into the red supply bag, supplies are packed into the blue bag, the polling location binder is closed, and the green poll pad case is packed. Those 4 items are loaded into a PEO's car. The ballots in the red bag must be under the watchful eye of the PEOs at all times. A Republican PEO and a Democratic PEO must ride in the same car with the ballots back to the Board of Elections. Pro PEO tip. To account for this, precinct teams have planned who is going to be responsible for this important task in advance, and those 2 PEOs have met at the BOE in the morning. They drive together in one car to the polling location. Then the PEOs both have their cars there to drive home after a long day of being an election superhero. This is the early in-person voting schedule. Be sure to schedule yourself time to come in and early vote before Election Day. Click the link in the notes under this video to take the quiz.